Well, good morning, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. And this morning, by the grace of a number of very good people that have connected me with the Schiller Institute and now with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome Helga to the show. Good morning, Helga. It's so nice to have you here.
Yes, good morning.
And thanks for joining us. And special thanks to Harley Schlanger, whose kindness led to this interview this morning. Well, usually with a guest, I would spend some time getting some biographical information and perhaps learning about fields of expertise and things like that. But I've got a lot on my mind. I think that the world right now is in a very precarious place, and I want to take advantage of your expertise and your experience this morning by going straight into some of the content of what my show's about and what questions I think we need to face. And one of them, I think, is I just want to start from where Harley Schlanger has mentioned this morning in his broadcast on LaRouchePAC.org. And Harley's call for an end to the special relationship, with Great Britain, which has been the keystone of American foreign policy since a long, well, I don't know since when, but how important is it that we face this issue to allow our country to move on and out of the clutches of the old world and the old money system that has just tied us down like Lilliputians tying down Gulliver in Jonathan Swift's great book? I'll leave you with that question.
Well, I think if you look at the origin of almost any conflict in the world today, you always find the hand of the British. It's the old idea that, it's the British brain and the American muscle. This has to do with, the American Revolution, the American War of Independence. The British never forgave the largest or the most important colony for that idea of being independent. So they tried to reverse it first with military means. This was the War of 1812, then the Civil War, where the British were allied with the Confederacy. And then after that, they realized they could not reconquer the United States militarily. So they then changed their tactics and said, well, then we have to convince the American establishment that they adopt the model of the British Empire to rule the world. And let's have a special relationship. And that really has been the dominant dynamic for the 20th century and unfortunately into the 21st century. And I think that idea to have an unipolar world, which is another word for empire, is really the cause of all the problems we see today. Let it be the confrontation with Russia, with China, or the absolute underdevelopment of the developing sector. In all of these, you always find the trace back to the British Empire. And unfortunately, the Washington establishment, and there is really no big difference between the two parties, for the most part, have really, adopted that model, and they insist on the unipolar world based on the special relationship. And I think that is the prescription for World War III if it's not changed.
Well, they've been speaking a lot about a rules-based world order, and I think that's what you're talking about when we say, that they want to have rules, but they're going to be their rules, and they're going to decide how the rules are applied and how they're enforced or not. And in a broad sense, I think there's a power that still exists from ancient times, and in the sense of perhaps the vestiges of European nobility and the upper classes in the United States, whether in the Northeast or in the California area based around Stanford and all of that. this idea of an American establishment that has some kind of a hegemony over the rest of the people that are citizens of this country reflects a distinction between the nobility and the peasant classes of Europe to me. And is that part of what I'm seeing in American education has been, people have been talking about it for years, this idea of Rockefeller's molding our children instead of into thinkers and humanists and people that want to improve humanity, but into mere servants or serf-like beings that won't be upset by rules. They'll just follow them. That's a big question, but I think to paint broadly over the past 50 or 60 years, that British influence has been what's been the word I think is subversion, to subverting our values, subverting our belief in ourselves and in our destiny as a leader of freedom, as opposed to as you said before, the muscle for the brains of the British Empire.
Yeah, I mean, my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, he always used to say that the concept of the empire is like a slime mold. The slime mold changes the color, the form, but it essentially remains a slime mold. And I think that's a very good concept to understand that the idea that there is a ruling elite on top of the empire, and that the most part of the population are underlings. They're kept backward as much as possible, because if they are backward, it's more easy to rule over them. That has been the characteristics of empires, let it be, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, Venice as an empire, the Dutch British Empire, or the British Empire as such. The form is different, but if you look, for example, at the Roman Empire, how did they control the population? They had the circuses, they had the gladiators, and then, they would make the entertainment in such a way that the audience could decide if the gladiator would die or live by putting some up or some down. Put it in the picture here, some up or some down. And by involving the audience in this way, you evoke primitive and low emotions, like bloodlust and, sports kind of cheering with one against the other. And by doing that, you corrupt people. You make them as evil as that which is being orchestrated and portrayed. And I remember there was a movie a couple of years ago, maybe already some decades ago, called The Gladiator. And I was reading some articles in the British press which said, yeah, we need these kinds of movies from time to time because, we have to control the emotions of the people, because that's how you can keep the population in check. And what is the difference? I mean, you had the circus and the lions eating the Christians in the time of the Roman Empire. But now it's the same principle with banal entertainment, with spectator sports, with all kinds of things, popular culture of various kinds, things which make people low, or make them not thinking, to prefabricate what they should think. And that is the characteristics of oligarchy, that the ordinary person is being reduced to not think about the large issue of war and peace, of what form of government should be, like the issues which were discussed in the Federalist Papers, to not think about that, but to just go along, be happy, have holiday, or try to have good meals or whatever, to make people as banal as possible, because then you can rule over them. And that is the problem. I think that the biggest worry I have is that we are in an incredibly dangerous situation concerning the danger of nuclear war. But most people, they couldn't be further away from that, because, it doesn't enter their concerns. They don't read about it in the newspaper. But that doesn't mean the danger is not very real. So a population which has been made, servile in this way, you can lead to anything. They are not a problem, and that I think is the problem.
This reflects thinking over decades and generations, and it reminds me of my generation being taught to duck and cover, the meaning to get down and under your little schoolhouse desk. We had these little desks, and you were to you crouch down and cover yourself underneath the top of the desk if a nuclear warning went out over the radio. And we were taught to do that as perhaps to get control of us from an early age, so that when we were, verbally triggered with the idea of nuclear, instead of standing up and saying, "Wait a minute, let's analyze this threat. Let's see what we have to do to reduce this threat, and let's confront this issue like reasonable people," we are going to revert to our childhood's experience and just hide from it, get under the desk. That kind of a psychological program has been, I see it reflected in so many areas of my research, that I do believe that there is a massive program of exactly that subversion, to take away our ability to confront danger, as well as our ability to confront infringement of our rights that our forefathers have fought for, including, the fathers of most of us that are of my age.
Yeah, I think that the changes, the paradigm changes are big. Again, my late husband, who participated in the Burma theater, and he was in India in the Second World War, he always told me, that the change which came from the generation which, was ready to fight Hitler, who was, courageous in fighting World War II, and Roosevelt wanting to end colonialism with the Bretton Woods system by bringing development to all the developing countries, that idea, when Roosevelt died and Truman took over, who was very much under the control of Churchill, the people went to suburbia, and they started to become petty bourgeois and petty-minded. And now you have generations, for whom the experience of a world war, especially in the United States, means absolutely nothing. In Germany, I would say it's still a little bit different, because if you had 2 world wars on your territory, then, this is sort of in your genes, because even your grandparents and your parents, they would tell you so many stories that it somehow has a bigger reality. For the United States, the idea of war is, it's something you fight over there. You go to Vietnam, or you go to Iraq, Afghanistan, and you have returning soldiers who are traumatized. So there is a certain experience. But, I think people have no idea that the war, if it breaks out, could come to the United States. And that is why I thought it was quite important that Tulsi Gabbard, about 2 weeks ago, she was on a show with Tucker Carlson, and she made a very, very dramatic appeal to people to pay attention to this war danger. And she went into a very plastic description, how the bone, the flesh would be ripped from the bones if there would be a nuclear war, if thousands of missiles would drop on all American cities. It was quite dramatic. But I thought, this is useful, because you somehow have to wake people up, because, when World War I happened, people afterwards said, people were sleepwalking into World War I. And I think, we are now at the verge of exactly that situation, but the costs potentially are much higher, because we have now thermonuclear weapons.
Well, I'll be frank with you. I personally don't get too motivated when I hear the threat of nuclear war. Maybe I'm a victim of that phenomenon I was describing, that I don't sense an urgent need to address the problem. That may be typical of Americans. I don't. what's probably more urgent need to me has been all of the studies that I and other colleagues have been doing about the threat of biological warfare and the spread of these biological warfare production facilities all over the world that seem to be associated, at least the ones that seem to stand out, with NATO or with the United States, with the United States military. Of course, we've always been told that it would be Saddam Hussein who came up with the biological and chemical weapons, but they didn't find those in Iraq. But nevertheless, there's significant evidence now that Western powers are developing biological weapons and vaccines to combat them, that perhaps our soldiers have been given these vaccines to see, as guinea pigs to work on. And to me, that's a more imminent threat. That's something that we can talk about and perhaps do something about. Are folks in Europe generally and in your circle considering that as a possible way of active warfare? In other words, unleashing something a lot worse than the coronavirus.
Well, maybe there are some people, but I believe in reality, and this question of war danger is not something one cannot find out about. For example, you have the commander of the Stratcom, the Strategic Command of the United States, whose name is Admiral Charles Richard, and he in February went on record to say that he instructed the Pentagon to move the category of likelihood of a nuclear war from not very likely to very likely. And, I mean, if you look at Putin, Putin gave a speech to the Federation Association, to the Federation Council about a week ago, where he warned that there are red lines which should not be crossed by NATO. And then he proceeded to say that one of these red lines has been crossed in Belarus, that they have now, from the FSB, that's the successor of the KGB, evidence that there was a coup attempt and assassination attempt in planning against President Lukashenko of Belarus. And he said this goes too far. So, I mean, if you look at the crisis, you have Ukraine being really out of control with, the Eastern Ukrainian situation. You have the expulsion of diplomats from Ukraine, from Czech Republic, from Belarus. And, all of this is reaching a point where, all the republics of the former Soviet Union are now basically instigated, or their regime change operations, like against President Zeman of Czechia, simply because he said that there is no information on this so-called story where two Russians blew up or were supposed to have blown up an ammunition depot in 2014, and Zeman went on record saying that he knows from the intelligence of Czech Republic that this did not happen. Then the Speaker of the Parliament is demanding the removal of Zeman for high treason. Now, this is incredible. They expelled 60 diplomats. So you have now diplomats being expelled from Poland, from Ukraine, from Czech Republic. And, the ambassador of Russia in the United States has been called back since weeks. He's not in Washington. The American ambassador has been basically asked to leave and go back to the United States for consultations. So we are in an incredibly heightened situation, and people are not even aware of it, and I think that is really the problem.
No, diplomacy is nowhere on the radar screen of American televisions. It's just not there. And what you mentioned is news to me. The parliament you're referring to, is that the European Parliament or the Czech Republic's parliament?
That was the Czech parliament. The Speaker of the House of the Czech parliament wants to remove the president of the Czech Republic for high treason. I mean, that's unheard of, simply because he said that his information from the secret services of Czech Republic say there was no Russian involvement. And since we were talking about the British before, the British are saying, that it was the same two Russians who blew up this ammunition depot in 2014, who supposedly were responsible for the Skripal murder attempt. And it did not exist. So you have all of these operations being cooked up, which, and there's an American analyst, a military professor, his name is Lyle Goldstein, and he said, he had just a very interesting article saying that a nuclear war with China could mean the end of civilization. So you have like Tulsi Gabbard, Lyle Goldsmith, a couple of other people who are talking about that. But I think what we need to have is a public debate, because we are talking about the existence of the human race. There are some people who think that you can have a limited nuclear war. But I have studied this very much in depth, and I have consulted some of the best writers like Ted Postol from MIT and such people. And they have made the argument that there is no limited war, because once you use one missile, one nuclear missile, it's the logic of the difference between nuclear war, nuclear weapons, and conventional weapons, that all nuclear weapons will be used. And I think the people who understand how serious this is, I'd rather have the people not sleep and freak out and start to think about it, rather than sit there until it is too late and there's not even a historian left who could report about it.
I find it very interesting that this brinkmanship towards nuclear war is happening at a time when our media is still inundated with reporting about the COVID virus, the COVID-19 virus, and the dramatic arguments over lockdowns versus freedom of movement, freedom of speech, and these things are alienating Americans against each other as this nuclear threat is building in the background. And that I don't mean to say that these things are intentionally set up to be coinciding, but it is convenient to those people that want to keep Americans from paying attention, from really watching the actual diplomatic disaster that you described. You said other ambassadors were being recalled. Could you give us more about that?
No, diplomats, not ambassadors. The Czech Republic first expelled 18 Russian diplomats. Then Russia, in return, expelled 20 Czech diplomats. Then the Czech expelled 60 Russian diplomats. So there's practically nobody left. It's pretty severe. But coming back to what you just said about the pandemic, I think the British like always to divide and conquer, because they lose all power if they lose the ability to play one side against the other. That has been the characteristic of the British Empire, way back, since the existence of it. And I think what we should be discussing is we must find a way of cooperating. I think in the age of thermonuclear weapon, to think that war can be a means of conflict resolution potentially means, the self-destruction of civilization. And, it's simply not true that Russia or China are a danger. I know that this probably will be controversial, and, maybe you don't agree with that, I don't know. But I have no reason to think that Russia is out to conquer the world. Russia has quite their own problems. They have a difficult economic situation. They want to get their economy in order. China is, trying to fulfill certain ambitions to take back a role on the world stage, but they are not trying to replace the United States as a unipolar force, and they are not aggressive. It's simply not true. So maybe we should talk about these issues a little bit.
My pleasure. I personally don't find either China or Russia to be a credible threat that we should be confronting, but that's because I've been studying it myself, and with the help of a lot of other folks have changed my mind. But you're exactly right. That is an attitude that needs to be discussed and discussed again in American media. Because once again, they're going to fall for the better dead than red rhetoric of the 1950s. Americans are not total captives of the media. We'd like to believe that we're still free, but the media has incredible influence on what we think about, and more. I think that we should also consider what we do not think about as we get distracted by Oscars and soap operas and the inevitable murder mysteries that just hit us one after another. If you look at mainstream television, that these distractions are not just for our entertainment. I think it's been a big long-term program to again take us away from looking at the serious issues of the day. So let's spend more time on Russia and China. What do you think has been? Have you had any success in speaking to American audiences, or perhaps other audiences in Europe that are similarly skeptical about Russia? And how does one approach the subject in order to make progress with the general public?
Well, it's really all about the control of the narrative, I mean, at a certain point, Putin said if there would not have been the Ukraine issue, they would have invented one. If you look at the narrative, the situation was when the Soviet Union disintegrated, there would have been the chance to really make a new peace order for the 21st century. Communism was collapsed, there was no more enemy. And, we, meaning my husband, myself, and our organization, we proposed to unify the Eurasian continent through what we called a Eurasian land bridge. This was the idea to connect the population centers and industry centers of Europe with those of Asia through so-called development corridors. That would have been a way to improve the conditions of the landlocked areas of the Eurasian continent, because when you have rivers or oceans, then, trade is very easy. But if you have wide landlocked regions, then that is sort of an obstacle. But by putting in fast train systems, waterways, highways, you could have opened up the Eurasian continent for development and uplift the population on a higher level of productivity. That would have been in the interest of all the countries of Eurasia. Now, that is still a proposal. And, right now, Russia, China, they have moved in this direction. China has proposed the new Silk Road. This is a very positive intervention, and the Chinese have invited the United States to participate. Now, I think if the United States would spend the money which is going into military budgets right now, this year it's $780 billion. That's an enormous amount of money. If that money would be spent in infrastructure in the United States, wouldn't it not be much more beneficial for the United States? I was just reading an article, I think it was this one I just mentioned, where they say that China developed the largest fast train system in the world. They have now 40,000 kilometers. That's about more than 30,000 miles of fast train systems. They go 350 kilometers per hour. They are now working on a maglev train, which goes, it's already in exercise, but when it's built, it will go 600 kilometers per hour. That's more than 400 miles per hour. And this is connecting all major cities in China. Now, the Chinese in all that time have not spent that money in a military buildup. And now, because of all of this, provocations, they are now in an armament drive. There is a nuclear race going on, which is very dangerous. But, if the United States would say, okay, we cooperate with China on the development of Eurasia, on eliminating the famine, that Beasley, the head of the World Food Program, has said that there are 270 million people in danger of dying of starvation this year. You have a pandemic out of control in India right now with 360,000 new infections per day. Brazil is out of control. And, I have said from the very first day, it was clear that this was a pandemic, that you need to have a modern health system in every single country, because unless you, get the population medically treated and have a modern system, it will come back. You cannot have Haiti or Mali or any other poor country being a petri dish of new virus strains without risking that these viruses come back and nullify the effect of the vaccines you already have developed in the so-called advanced sector. So why not join hands rather than have a confrontation? Join hands with Russia, China, and all the other nations and say, we build up a new modern health system in every single country, because that's the only way how we can defeat the pandemic. Now, if you want to have modern hospitals, you need water, clean water. You need electricity. 2 billion people in the world don't have access to clean water. So we need lots of new energy, lots of clean water. And you don't have that if you don't build infrastructure. So why not take the pandemic as the beginning point to overcome the underdevelopment of the developing countries, which is, in my view, the moral test of civilization, if we are fit to survive or not. Because if we cannot change our ways, and if we take it as granted that billions of people are deprived of their humanity because they are poor, being poor is the biggest violation of human rights you can imagine. Because if you are poor, you have not enough to eat, you don't have good housing, you don't have health care, you don't have education, you can't fulfill your potential as a human being. So why not join hands and go for a poverty eradication alleviation program, working together, stop geopolitical thinking, and work together in the benefit of each other in a reciprocal, cooperative form of collaboration. I think either we manage to make that jump, or we may not make it as a civilization.
That to me is that's the dream. But I have to say I'm seeing so many obstacles between here and that dream. Number one, the media doesn't give us that information that we're really that close to this disaster. Number two, the American people are not at all focused on this as a problem, and I don't see anybody in a political. This is the real difficulty I have is what politician. You mentioned Tulsi Gabbard. I wish her well. I hope that she proves out to be an honest servant of the people and all of the great things that I think she does represent. But I don't know yet. She's not very experienced, and she definitely comes from the military. So I have to wonder. But where is there a will among any of the politicians? Not in the United States, I'll tell you. But perhaps in Europe, is there any place I can look? Australia, maybe, of a politician that would take up your banner and go with it?
Well, unfortunately, politics is not exactly in the shape it should be. George Washington, when he left office, he warned against political parties. He said parties are very dangerous because it means that people take a lobby point of view. They take a partial interest against somebody else's partial interest. And therefore, he was really extremely, warning people of the character of political parties. My late husband, when he was 90, he made a beautiful birthday speech, and he said we should abandon political parties because they're vehicles of corruption. They're just not working out. So what we are trying to do right now is a completely different approach. I have proposed something which you might find even more difficult to understand, and that is to build a committee of coincidence of opposites. Now, that is a notion which comes from a philosopher, Nicolaus of Cus, who lived in the 15th century. He is very important. He was really the father of the nation state. He was the first one who developed the notion of a sovereign nation state, and he was the father of modern science. So if he's not known, that's another one of these things which should be remedied. He proposed that the human being is capable of thinking on a higher level than the level on which conflicts arise. Now, if you have a confrontation between one group and another one, or countries, what he argues is that the human mind is capable of thinking the one as having a higher power than the many. And that is really the idea, that if you think about the interest of the one humanity before you think about the national interest of the different countries, you have an approach. And I'm absolutely certain that it was that thinking which went into the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe in 1648. And I proposed such an approach when the assassination of the murder of George Floyd occurred, because I saw immediately the danger of race wars and social conflict and so forth. So I proposed to create a committee of coincidence of opposites, which was the idea that you intervene with a concept which serves the interest of all participating forces. What that meant concretely, I said we have a pandemic. People don't understand health measures. So why don't we take some of the young people, train them in a program like Roosevelt did with the CCC program, with which he educated the youth at the time to participate in the TVA and other programs, and educate these youth to be medical assistants so that they can teach the population of why you need clean hands, why you need hand washing, hygienic measures, social distancing, why you need to wear masks. But at the same time, you train more people and you create partnerships between cities and hospitals in the United States and, for example, in African cities. And then you add that we need to make donations of food, because we have a famine, and medical supplies to some of the countries which absolutely need it. And by putting together doctors, nurses, farmers who are in a big crisis too, because the cartels make their production so ineffective that many are threatened with bankruptcy. But we really would need to double food production, because there's a starving world, there will be an increase in population, and we should double the food production to make sure people have enough to eat now and in the next years. So if you take all of these aspects together and you assemble people from the farm sector, the medical sector, young people, you make partnerships with countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, you can give these young people a mission. Because what's the problem? In the United States, you have the suicide rate among young people is incredibly high. The drug addiction, the violence not only in the schools, but also mass shootings. I mean, the whole country is in such a crisis that you need to inject some idea of a mission which goes beyond the individual interest and which does something good for society as a whole, and not just American society, but the whole world. So this was an idea which took a little while. There were some reasons why it didn't take place right away so quickly, but now we have it together. We are working with medical organizations, doctors, nurses. We are already engaged in a project to bring food aid and medical aid to Mozambique. And we have a project of teaching young people in Washington, where basically they are now committing themselves to become community health workers. And that way you get the young people out of their terrible situation, and you give them a mission. And I think that this is a concept which must be expanded. And if there are any people among your viewers who want to cooperate, I mean, please contact us, because this idea of this committee of coincidence of opposites is a way to put together people from completely different interest groups and have them work together for a higher goal. So I think that's something everybody can do, and you don't need to look for politicians, because they may be good or not. I don't know about Tulsi Gabbard. She's a little bit too green for my taste. But, it's the people who have to be mobilized, because, you cannot always defer the responsibility of where society goes to some people who right now are many times, I think the United States and many European countries are really a plutocracy rather than a democracy, because if Wall Street buys the seat of a congressman for several $1 million, I wouldn't really call that democracy. It's a plutocracy.
Actually, that was going to be my next question, was how do you view the United States right now after the past election, and then in the context of your observations over the past many years? I agree with you completely. It's not a democracy. And with that in mind, that's the other problem, is that people in this country still think it's a democracy. And I've been trying to tell people that, no, it's not anymore. And in my mind, my analysis is that the democracy ended on November 22nd of 1963. So it's been a long time, and the forces of the empire have been busy ever since then, dismantling, subverting, and taking our affection away from our country by examples like George Floyd, by examples of that in some cases I think are created by psychological warfare units to give us the impression that we're a bad country. But and I'm sure that people around the world are bombarded with the idea that the United States is the great Satan, as was used to the phrase from the Ayatollah in the past. Well, are we really the great Satan? No, I just think that we've been put in a trance, like the fairy princess, and we're not aware that all this subversion is going on. So the wonderful ideas that you have are held down by the forces of our economy, for instance. Who can just get up and leave their job, who hasn't already put away a nice nest egg for their retirement? The answer is virtually nobody. If our 401k plans, which is our kind of individual retirement plans, or if the pensions we've been promised, if they suddenly disappear, then we're screwed. We as individuals have made ourselves completely dependent upon this economy based upon the U.S. dollar that is now getting, from my point of view, turned into a future bunch of wallpaper, because they're printing so many dollars. So my concern is how can the people do anything about it when they are chained to the system themselves through their own needs of getting gas for the car, getting food for the table?
I know it's a big problem. And, I think the only thing you can do is you can talk to people about the image of man, because I think a lot of confusion starts with that. For example, the so-called ecologists, they have convinced themselves and many others that human beings are a burden on nature, that human beings are parasites which disturb Mother Earth, and that, to protect nature, the less people, the better. All of these things, they are out there. And, one has to really go back to the idea that human beings are completely different than all other species, that human being is the only individual who can, because of his creative power, her creative power, discover physical principles of the physical universe. I mean, whenever you do that and you discover a qualitative new idea about how the universe works, this is called scientific progress. And, with that application of that progress, I'm sorry, I have to drink some water.
Yeah, I know.
When you apply that technological progress, you increase the living standard, you increase the productivity, the longevity of people. And that is how human beings have managed to develop from a few million, at 20,000 years ago, to now almost 8 billion. And if we would apply existing technologies, we could green the desert, we could make habitable all those areas of the planet which are not. And if you look at the fact that in February alone, 3 nations did a successful Mars mission: the United Arab Emirates, China, and the United States. And they're now discovering water on Mars. There is an effort to find out if there are traces of life. You had for the first time a little helicopter flying on a planet which, it has a very, very thin atmosphere, which was an economic breakthrough of incredible dimensions. Now, if you think how the human species has developed from the age of the Stone Age, or the time where we were hunters and gatherers, when people just were eating berries and eating rabbits, if we would have stayed on that level, which is about what animals normally do, they pick whatever nature produces, but they cannot increase the production of carrots. For example, I've never seen donkeys making fields of carrots because they want to have a better breakfast. But human beings have made all of these discoveries. We have now the possibility to colonize the moon, to colonize Mars, and these are only stepping stones for things to come, for interstellar travel. All of this is already on the horizon. And, all we need to do is we have to put in cohesion the intellectual and emotional development with that technological capability. That's called aesthetic education. Now, I believe what Friedrich Schiller, who is this German poet after whom the Schiller Institute is named, he said that any political improvement comes from the aesthetical education. This was his answer to the collapse of the French Revolution after the Jacobins had taken over. And I believe that that is absolutely true, that by exposing people to beautiful ideas, especially in great culture, in classical art, that you can improve them, that you can make them better human beings. And I think there is no short way other than doing that. I believe that we are in such a crisis that either we try to improve our contemporary citizens through an aesthetical education, that's the only way.
I'm with you. I love the idea of bringing it back. It's like the pendulum has just swung too far against aesthetical education, as you put it, and our schools are completely devoid now of the idea of artistic creativity being part of a child's life and part of being a fully rounded human being. Um, that's what we need. We need fully rounded human beings and human beings that are willing to ask difficult questions and answer them as best we can and share what we know and try to remain hopeful. You, my experience with your institute has been just delightful. I'm thrilled to meet everyone, and thank you each and every one of you that has made this morning's show possible. We have a lively chat room, which I haven't been able to check on because I've been so deeply involved in this great conversation. Uh, Now, you have an event coming up that I want to make sure people are aware of on May the 8th. And Andy, do you have a graphic you can show for that? And perhaps, Helga, if you want to talk about that for a minute, and then we'll wrap up the show.
Yes, this will be very important because this will be a conference, virtual conference on the internet. We have top speakers already who will discuss what I touched upon, the danger of war, what to do about it, but also how to overcome the world famine, how to build a new health system in every country. And, we will have people from the United States, from Europe, Russia, the Middle East. So it will be very, very important. This committee of coincidence of opposites will play a major role. We will have doctors, farmers. So I would really encourage you to make sure that you participate in that. And you can look at the Schiller Institute website, look at our recent conference on the 20 and 21st of March, which was a real, absolute fantastic conference to give you a taste that there are entire dimensions opening up once you start to engage on the path, what we have been talking about. So I invite you all to participate because you will see that there are many like-minded people who are fighting for a better world.
That's fabulous. And on that note, I think we'll end the show. Folks, be sure and check out the Schiller Institute and mark your calendars for May the 8th for a very interesting and important conference that'll tell us more about Helga's idea of the what is it? The coincidence of opposites?
Yes, it comes from Nicolaus of Cus. In Latin, it says coincidentia oppositorum. It means that on the higher level, which the human creativity can think, that you can overcome all contradictions. And that is a practical idea. That's not a philosophical idea only, but it has extremely practical implication for practically every conflict on this planet.
Okay, thank you so much. And Andy, we'll leave it right here. Thanks everybody for being with us, and I'll see you tomorrow.